Harry Bradbury from Fairmont, who organized the adult education fair and invited me on so many occasions, especially to the Lenten series. So we're so glad that you're here today. Thank you. And for those who are here for the first time this morning, whether in person or on Zoom, we have been exploring women leaders in early Christianity. And we began with the famous Phoebe because of a sensational archaeological discovery at the eastern port of Corinth. A Vanderbilt archaeologist, a friend of mine, Joseph Reif, discovered a large octagonal monument built, he argues, to commemorate the great Phoebe, deaconess and the patron of Paul and other early Christians. After that, we looked at Mary Magdalene in the Gospels and the Gospel of Mary, which most people, I think, had not read. We then moved last week to look at the fascinating story of an early Christian woman named Thecla, who followed Paul across the Mediterranean, baptized herself, and embarked upon an apostolic ministry. Today, we move to North Africa, to the area around the big city of Carthage in the early 3rd century. And this remarkable text, which survives in both Latin, in which it was apparently composed, and a Greek translation, is sometimes called the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas. The text that I gave you translates the Latin Passio into martyrdom. And this translation, by the way, I have a personal connection to the translator. It is the great Herbert Musarillo, longtime chairman of the Department of Classics at Fordham University in New York City. And if you visit me there for lunch on Arthur Avenue, I can take you to a monument on the campus commemorating the great Herbert Musarillo. He translated the Acts of the Christian Martyrs. And this is one of the texts from his translation. Now, what is so wonderful about this text is that it is the oldest surviving writing by a Christian woman. This is not just about a Christian woman. Embedded within the text is evidently her prison diary, a remarkable document. And even the most critical scholars are inclined to believe that it is authentic. Why? Because of the voice that speaks here. That is the literary style. It is spontaneous and emotional. And it is different from the style and the voice of the editor who has produced the final text. We don't know who the editor was. He is anonymous. A good argument was made by Timothy Barnes, an old mentor and friend of mine from Canada, from Toronto. He wrote the best book ever written on the North African church father Tertullian, who lived at about the same time as Perpetua. And Timothy Barnes argued that Tertullian could well be the editor of this document. Now that's interesting because Tertullian is such an influential church father. You may be surprised that Christianity had spread so quickly across North Africa. But that is in fact the case. Large numbers of conversions and influential Christian writers, theologians, not only Tertullian, but the great Cyprian of Carthage in the next generation. So Perpetua is one of those early North African converts. And this text is so remarkable because it is apparently the oldest surviving text by a Christian woman. It is dated to the year 203 AD because in the course of the text, there is a reference to the Roman proconsul under whom Perpetua was put on trial, imprisoned, and eventually put to death. She did not escape like Thecla last week. And the name of that proconsul is Menicius. Now, he is a historical figure. He was proconsul of North Africa from about 199 to 203. And so that establishes the date for the martyrdom of Perpetua. Felicitas, as you may have discerned by reading the text, Felicitas is the slave, an enslaved person who belongs to Perpetua. Perpetua is described in the text as a noble woman of a good family, honorably married. Now, the text suggests that she is actually a Roman citizen, and that is because of her name. Her name is Vivia Perpetua. You can see that at the very beginning. A number of young catechumens were arrested. Bevocoptus, who is himself a slave, and his fellow slave, Felicitas, Saturninus and Secundulus, and with them, Vivia Perpetua, a newly married woman of good family, Latin says noble family, and upbringing. Now, this name, Vivia, is a giveaway. You may know that proper Roman citizens had three names, like many people today. And the first name is the personal name, like Julius. Gaius. Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius is his first name. The middle name of a Roman citizen is the family name, the gens. And Vivia is a gens name. A proper Roman citizen belongs to a tribe, to a gens. And Vivia is the proper name of a Roman tribe. So it would appear that she is not just a wealthy, noble woman, but evidently also a Roman citizen. And that helps to explain the tension that inhabits this text, which is a political tension. She is expected as a Roman citizen to support, to pledge allegiance to the Roman Empire. And the way that you did that, does anyone know? A simple ceremony. It had been used for 2 centuries. You offered sacrifice, just a pinch of incense, or some grain, or a small animal like a dove. You offered a sacrifice to the living emperor, as if he were what? A god. And on some Roman coins, the emperors of that period actually proclaimed themselves to be a god. Domitian's coins have around the edge, instead of "In God We Trust," Domitian's coins have "Domitianus Deus Noster." Latin scholars, our God. Right? Well, the emperor in 203 AD was a man named Septimius Severus. He was himself a North African. He's a Roman, but he came, the Romans had settled North Africa. Last Christmas, our son, Mark, who lives now in Los Angeles, he has a landscape gardening business, and one of his super wealthy clients who designs advertisements for Guess jeans and other glitzy clothing manufacturers, one of Mark's wealthy clients gave him a bust of Septimius Severus, looking very severe. And Mark didn't want it, so when he visited us at Christmas, he loaded what he called his head boy into the back of his Ford F-150, and it now sits in our garden. Philadelphia Drive, frightening the neighbors. According to our next door neighbor, his eyes follow wherever you move. Well, Septimius Severus promulgated a decree at the end of the second, beginning of the 3rd century. And the decree read like this: conversion to Judaism and Christianity is prohibited. Prohibited. We owe this information to Eusebius, the great church historian. In his church history, reports that Septimius Severus issued this decree, and although Septimius himself is not known particularly as a persecutor, local authorities, local governors, and proconsuls seized upon this decree in order to stop or attempt to stop the spread of Christianity. Christianity was spreading very rapidly in the 3rd century. All of the people mentioned here are catechumens. What does that mean? They are in the process of learning what it means to be a Christian. They're Christians in training. Even Perpetua, at the beginning of the story, has not yet been what? Baptized, right? So Christianity is spreading very rapidly. The great California sociologist who worked with Wayne Meeks came to the conclusion that it was because of the care that the early Christians took of the vulnerable, of poor, of women and children, that Christianity was spreading so quickly in the 3rd century, along with the Christian response to disease epidemics, which we have discussed here in a previous class. If you want to read about it, the background to the conversion of Perpetua is discussed in the book by Rodney Stark, California sociologist on religion. His book is called The Rise of Christianity. The subtitle, listen to this: How a Movement of Galilean Fishermen and Farmers Became the Dominant Religion of the Roman Empire in Only 3 Centuries. That's a long subtitle. Cover of the book, but you can pick it up cheaply as a paperback. And it is a wonderful book to read. I could also recommend a book by one of my mentors at Yale, the great social historian, Ramsay MacMullen. And Ramsay MacMullen has a book you would enjoy very much called Third Church. Third Church. And what he means by that, he investigates the Christian movement not through reading the lofty theologians like Cyprian and Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus, but rather by examining theological evidence, phase of sites, the cult of the saints and of the dead. He's trying to reconstruct what ordinary Christians believe at the end of the second and the beginning of the third century. And so he has a very fascinating discussion of the passion of Perpetua and Felicitas as evidence of a popular Christian movement that was growing very quickly. James. What would have been the first right. So he would have her support the Roman God. People who had political and religious beliefs in the Roman Empire were convinced that the empire itself was preserved by the maintenance of the Pax Deorum. Latin students, peace with the gods. So the empire itself depended upon a negotiation with the divine powers, with Jupiter, with Saturn, and all the pantheon of Roman gods. As long as they were on side, as long as they supported the Roman Empire, the empire would stand. And if you've read this text in advance, you may have noticed that when Perpetua and her slave Felicitas and the other martyrs, when they are brought into the arena in order to fight with the wild beast, the governor at first orders them to be dressed in the garb of Roman deities. The men are to dress as priests of Saturn, and the women are to dress as priestesses of Ceres. Ceres, of course, is the goddess of what? Grain, the grain harvest. Saturn is the father of Jupiter, right? So even in death, right, the idea was that these deviant Christians ought to be clothed in the arena as if they were priests and priestesses in the Roman religion, serving the Roman god. Yes.
Did Sergius see his reign from outside forces and then the flaming Christians being the problem because they weren't supporting the pantheon?
Yes, it is a well-justified suspicion. Why would he promulgate a decree forbidding conversion to Judaism and Christianity? The 3rd century was a period when the barbarians began to encroach upon the edges of the Roman Empire. It was also a period of economic turmoil. It was a period of general collapse. The great British classicist E.R. Dodds wrote a book called Pagans and Christians in an Age of Anxiety. Does that sound like our time?
Yeah.
And guess what he is describing? The 3rd century. The time of Septimius Severus and Perpetua. Now, Septimius responded to the anxiety of his time, military and economic. He responded vigorously. He was no milksop. If I could take the whole Epiphany class with me on a tour that would include Athens and Rome and probably Ephesus, when we walked in someday, when we walked into the Roman Forum, a great deal of what you see, the monumental architecture at least of the entrance to the forum on the north, was built by Septimius Severus. So he responded like another dictator in Russia today by monumental displays, right, of his own power, attempting to quell the anxiety that was there underneath the surface. So, according to Eusebius, Perpetua and her colleagues were persecuted by local North African governors who took advantage of the decree of Septimius Severus forbidding conversion to Judaism and Christianity. In a minute, when we turn to the text, you will notice that Perpetua's account of her experience is in the first person. Remarkable. She was keeping a prison diary, and it is clearly distinguishable in style from the editor, who is writing in the third person. So Perpetua is giving her own account, and her account is rich with detail about her own physical and emotional state. She describes how heartbreaking it was when her father tried to persuade her to offer the sacrifice. Just conform, go along, save the family. She describes the pain of being separated from her newborn child. Not only an emotional pain, but a physical pain. She had been nursing the child and her breast. She describes the pain that she felt in her breast, not being able to nurse. The editor then takes over. Perpetua's first person account breaks off on the evening before the beast fight in the amphitheater. And then the editor takes over and describes what happened when she was and the others were sent to fight with the beast. In a minute, if we look at the text in detail, you will see that Perpetua's prison diary contains the account of two remarkable visions that were given to her. Hard to tell if these are dreams or visions or something in between, but they are very detailed, full of imagery. Psychologists have analyzed them. If you go online, you'll see there's a new book, relatively new book, offering a psychological interpretation of the visions of Perpetua. Now, not long before the composition of this text, there was a revival, a Holy Spirit revival in early Christianity that is called by historians Montanism. Does anyone know about Montanism? It's named after the founder of the group, Montanus, who lived in Phrygia, a wild area in northern Turkey. He was converted to Christianity. He had been a priest of Cybele, and he promulgated an eschatological teaching that the new Jerusalem was about to descend upon the earth. And he attracted followers. And what he preached was this, that the Holy Spirit was still active. He preached that Christians could receive new revelation and new visions, and that this would be a renewal of the Christian movement, late 2nd, early 3rd century. Was Perpetua a Montanist? Tertullian had a Montanist period when he flirted with this Holy Spirit revival. Are Perpetua's visions and dreams evidence that she was a follower of Montanus? My much admired senior colleague from Canada, Timothy Dwight Barnes, in the first edition of his book on Tertullian, the best book on Tertullian ever written. He worked on it for 20 years. And in the first edition, he argued that Perpetua was a Montanist, and that her dreams and visions could be explained as the result of this revival of the Holy Spirit in early Christianity. Unfortunately, in the second edition of his book, published about 10 years later, he retracted all of that and argued that there was nothing about the passion of Perpetua that was inconsistent with Orthodox Christian teaching. Well, however that may be, we will look at her visions in just a minute. You'll see how amazing they are. The other thing that deserves comment that I want you to look out for is the clear evidence in this text that Christianity was challenging the traditional Roman family. The power of the father, the patria potestas, is being shaken. Her father cannot succeed in commanding her or even persuading Perpetua to offer a little pinch of incense as a sacrifice. So one of the most interesting things about this text is the way in which it portrays the relationship of Perpetua to her own father. His power is growing. She has an alternative value system. The reason, Jim, your question is such a good one is that the text makes clear that by the early 3rd century, the Romans had figured out, the Roman authorities had comprehended that Christianity represented a total, the identity and the loyalty of followers that was a rival to the total claim of the Roman Empire. So that's what we see here. We see superimposed above the everyday life of the family and its relationships to competing claims to identity and to moral behavior. On the one hand, Christianity, on the other hand, the Roman Empire. So Christianity is challenging the traditional family. The last thing I want you to look out for in that regard is that it says at the beginning that Perpetua was a newly married woman, but her husband is completely absent from the text. No mention of him anywhere. And of course, scholars speculate about the reason. Was he dead? Was he just away on business? And then I go to New York in order to be employed. Or had she rejected her husband? Montanus in northern Turkey encouraged his female followers to dissolve their marriages and to assert themselves as prophetesses who could receive new visions and revelations. But her husband is completely absent. No reference to him. Perhaps he chose to separate from his wife once she had started the process of becoming a Christian. Perhaps he just didn't want to be, his life to be in danger through association with Perpetua. Okay, let's take a look at the text. Such an interesting text. I want to start with Perpetua's own words in the diary. And it begins in the second paragraph. While we were still under arrest, she said, my father, out of love for me, was trying to persuade me and shake my resolution. Father, I said, do you see this vase here, for example? Or that water pump over there, whatever it is? Yes, I do, he said. I told him, could it be called by any other name than what it is? He said, no. Well, so too, I cannot be called anything other than what I am, which is a Christian. Christianus sum. I am a Christian. At this challenge, a logical challenge, a reasoned argument, at this, my father was so angered by the very word Christian that he moved towards me as though he would what? Pluck out my eye. But he left it at that. Vanquish all of his diabolical. So Perpetua for a few days is spared. The attempt by her father to coerce her into offering sacrifice and sparing her own life and the reputation of her family. And during that time, Perpetua was baptized, inspired by the Spirit, not to ask for any other favor than the water itself and the perseverance of the flesh. Now, she then says that she confesses that she found the prison itself to be amazingly terrible, a dark hole. And that's interesting because investigations of Roman prisons from this period reveal that a great many were simply cave-like structures cut into the side of a hill. If I could take the whole class with me to the ruins of Roman Philippi, you would see that there is a sign there identifying the prison of Paul, where Paul was imprisoned in Philippi. You have to get down on your knees to look into it because it is simply, you remember, Diane, it's simply a hole cut into the side of the hill. And for that reason, many Roman prisons lacked light, circulation of air, disease spread rapidly. As you'll see, one of Perpetua's colleagues dies in prison. He doesn't even survive the prison experience in order to fight with the beast in the arena. So Perpetua is terrified by the prison. She had never been in such a dark hole. Crowd, the heat was stifling. And the extortion of the soldiers. Do you know to what this makes reference? A typical feature of the experience of Roman prisons. The prison guards were often public slaves. And they had to be bribed to, can you guess what? Not to torture. They had to be bribed not to torture. That's how they paid extra money. Many scholars believe that when Paul refers to the stigmata tu Christu on his own body, Paul the prisoner, that he is referring to what? Torture marks inflicted by prison guards. So, she plays along with the system. She and her colleagues bribe the guards, the soldiers, to allow her and the others to go to a better part of the prison, a part of the prison where she is able to be with her child, to nurse her child, and even to receive visitors. And among those people who come to visit Perpetua is her brother. It is not said here whether her brother was already a Christian or was himself a catechumen. We don't know, but he says to her, "Dear sister, you are greatly privileged. Surely you might ask for what? A vision to discover whether you are to be condemned or free." She promises him that she will ask for a vision and that she will tell him tomorrow. She's confident that she will have a vision in the night. And here is what she saw. Now listen to her account of the vision. She says, I saw a ladder of tremendous height made of bronze. There is a TV documentary. You can go online and watch it about Perpetua. And the title of it is The Bronze Ladder. And it's an analysis of the visions of Perpetua. So she sees a tower, a ladder made of bronze reaching all the way up to the heavens. Now, the ladder is so narrow that only one person at a time can go up. And both sides of the ladder are bristling with weapons, knives and swords and spears, hooks and daggers and spikes, so that if you don't pay attention when you're climbing up, you're going to be what? Mangled by these weapons. But even before you can begin to mount the ladder, Perpetua sees at the foot of the ladder a dragon of enormous size. And it would attack anyone who tried to climb up it and to terrify them. Her fellow prisoner, Saturus, in her vision, he is the first to go up the ladder. And he goes up of his own accord. And when he gets to the top of the staircase, he calls out to her, Perpetua, I am waiting for you, but take care, do not let the dragon bite you. Now later, in the editor's account of what happened in the amphitheater, Saturus turns out to be the first martyr who dies. He is bitten in the throat by a leper. Single bite and his blood gushes out. So Perpetua's vision is prophetic. He is indeed the first one to mount the ladder. Perpetua believes that the dragon will not be able to harm her in the name of Christ Jesus, and so she begins to climb. She begins by stepping on the head of the dragon. He gives her a foot up, a leg up. And then slowly she begins to go up the ladder. When she gets to the top, she sees a gray-haired man in a shepherd's garb. And he is tending sheep and milking the sheep. And around him are thousands of people dressed in white robes. And he raises his head and looks at Perpetua and says, I'm glad you have come, my child. He called her over and gave her a mouthful of the sheep's milk. And all of those, when she drank it, all of those that stood around chanted, Amen. And then, at the sound of that word, she woke up with the taste of something sweet still in her mouth. She didn't have to pay a psychologist $150 an hour to analyze the dream vision. When she awakens, she knows what it means. It means that she will indeed suffer martyrdom. She will not escape. And so she can no longer place hope in this life. A few days have passed, and guess who comes back? Her father. Her father comes from the city worn with worry. It's interesting that the father is portrayed positively here. He's angry with her at first, but now he is worn down with worry, and eventually Perpetua has pity upon him. And I think most readers in the early 3rd century, members of families, they would have sympathized, I think, with the plight of this father. And we might feel the same way today. And Perpetua could have saved herself and the reputation of the whole family by simply doing what? Offering a little pinch of incense or grain. Why won't she do it? So the father comes worn with worry to persuade her daughter, he says. And now look, he resorts to the most convincing of all rhetorical arguments, the pathetic appeal. Daughter, have pity on my gray head. Have pity on me, your father. If I deserve to be called your father, you see, he's much more pitiful in his approach. Don't forget, I favored you above all your brothers. I raised you to reach the prime of life. In the editor's comments, before the text begins, he tells us that Perpetua was 22 years old. So she is still a young woman, but in the prime of life. Do not abandon me to the reproach of men. Think of your brothers, think of your mother and your aunt. Think of your child. Who will not be able to live once you are gone? Give up your pride. You will destroy all of us. None of us will ever be able to speak freely again if anything happens to you. It's a persuasive argument, isn't it? Yeah. When I discuss this text with my students at Fordham, I teach a course there on, it's called Moral Choices of the First Christians, and we read this text. And the students always sympathize with the father. This is the way her father spoke. She says, out of love for me, kissing my hands and throwing himself down before me with tears in his eyes, he no longer addressed me as his daughter. The Roman father would have had the authority to do what? A man. Roman law gave fathers the right to put their sons and daughters to death. Roman fathers had the right of life and death over their children. He's given up that right. He no longer addresses her as a daughter, but rather as a woman. And Perpetua is sorry for her father, because he alone of all my kin would be unhappy to see me suffer. She understands that he really cares about her. This text is fascinating because of the way in which it shows the impact of Christianity as a total system of belief and of ethics was beginning to challenge the Roman family. The family is no longer the source of ultimate value. Even though Perpetua is sorry for her father, she now has a higher authority to whom she is accountable. She tries to comfort him, saying, it is all in God's hands what will happen to him. So then they are whisked away while they're eating breakfast one morning. They are taken by the governor, Hilarianus, who had received judicial power from his, as his successor of the late proconsul Minucius. That's the one who is a real historical figure that allows us to date the text. And the governor says, have pity on your father's gray head. Have pity on your infant son. Offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors. I will not, she answered. Hilarianus says, are you a Christian? She condemns herself by saying, I am. Yes, I am. Now, her father still is not given up. He persists in trying to dissuade her. And the governor orders that her father be thrown to the ground and beaten with a rod. Perpetua feels sorry for her father, just as if she herself had been beaten. She feels sorry for his pathetic old age. Yes. Then Hilarianus passed sentence upon all of them, and we were condemned to the feast. But they returned to the prison in high spirits. She wants the baby to be brought to her. Her father at first refuses to give him over. But the good news is that the baby had no further desire for the breast, and she herself did not suffer any inflammation. So she was relieved of both anxiety and physical discomfort. Now, as the day for the beast fight is approaching, she has another vision. And in the middle of the next page is the account of her next vision. She looks at an enormous crowd who watched in astonishment and was surprised that no beasts were let loose upon her. But what she sees instead is an Egyptian. So this is not a Roman. It's a local native person, an Egyptian, of vicious appearance. And he has come with his seconds to fight against her. Her clothes are stripped off her, and suddenly she discovers that she is what? A man, able to fight in the arena. She saw the Egyptian preparing for the contest by rolling in the dust. And then in her visions, she sees a man of enormous, marvelous stature, rising above the top of the amphitheater, clad in a purple tunic with 2 stripes. And he carries a wand like an athletic trainer with a green branch on which there were golden apples. And he asked for silence and said, if this Egyptian defeats her, then he will slay her with the sword. But if she defeats him, she will receive this branch. And then in her vision, she saw herself and the Egyptian draw close to one another and begin to fight. Their fists begin to fly, and she begins to pummel him to the ground. She put her hands together. She linked her hands behind his head and threw him flat on his face. And the crowd begins to shout. Perpetua herself begins to sing a psalm. And she's the victor. She goes up to the athletic trainer and he kisses her and says, peace be with you, my daughter. And I began to walk in triumph towards the gates of light. And then she awakens from her dream vision and realizes that the Egyptian that she had seen in the vision was not just a native gladiator. The Egyptian was the image of what? The devil himself. And that her real struggle would be with the devil more than the beast in the amphitheater. And that is where Perpetua's prison diet breaks off. That's the end of it. And she says at the end, as for what I did after this, what happened at the contest itself, let him write of it who will. So that's where the narrator begins to relate what happened in the amphitheater. Perpetua was not the only one who suffered. Her slave, Felicitas, was pregnant in the prison. And according to Roman law, a pregnant woman could not be put to death in a beast fight in the arena. So Felicitas is praying that she will be delivered of the child so that she can accompany her colleague in martyrdom. And sure enough, 2 days before the contest, Felicitas gives birth. She goes into labor. It's a difficult labor, but she gives birth to a girl, and the girl is given to one of the Christian sisters who raises her as if she were her own daughter. And so then the narrator, the editor, tells the story of what happened to these martyrs. Perpetua and the others are taken into the amphitheater. They are given the last meal, what is called the free banquet, and they transform it into an agape feast. They Christianize it. They are led to the gates, and it says that the governor attempted to force them, Jim, to put on the robes of priest of Saturn, and the women to dress as priestesses of Ceres. But the noble Perpetua resisted this. She's not going to portray herself as part of the Roman religion. She says, we came to this of our own free will, and our freedom should not be violated. We pledged our lives, provided that we would not have to participate in the Roman imperial cult. You agreed to this. And so the military tribune says, find them. Just let them be taken into the arena just as they are, dressed as they are. And they are all dragged into the arena, and each one suffers the death for which they pray. Ask and you will receive. And so they receive the death for which they ask. The women, the two women, Perpetua and Felicitas, are tied to a mad heifer who physically hurts them. But Perpetua is described as being in a kind of trance. She doesn't seem to realize that she is being trampled and physically abused. And she wakes up from the trance. She awoke from a kind of sleep. So absorbed had she been in the ecstasy of the Spirit, and looked around her with amazement and said, when are we going to be thrown to that heifer or whatever it is? And of course, they have to tell her that she's already suffered that fate. Well, the story ends like this. They are abused by gladiators, and if they were not already dead, the gladiator puts in the sword. When the gladiator comes to Perpetua, he is either frightened or inexperienced because he misses her neck and strikes the bone, giving Perpetua a great deal of pain. But she takes the hand of the gladiator and guides it. She took the trembling hand of the young gladiator and guided it to her own throat. It was as though so great a woman, feared as she was by an unclean spirit, could not be dispatched unless she herself were willing. And except for some praise of these blessed martyrs, that's the end of the text. A remarkable text, isn't it? A remarkable text. Questions, comments? Perpetua, of course, is regarded as a saint in both the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. Her day, if you want to commemorate it and celebrate it, is March the 7th in the Catholic Church. She was briefly bumped off of that date by the canonization of St. Thomas Aquinas. But eventually she was restored to March the 7th, and Thomas Aquinas had to look for another day. So she's still venerated as a saint in both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. In the Orthodox Church, her saint's day is in February. Comments, Larry?
You gave the care that Christians gave to the marginalized people.
Yes.
And in pandemic, especially. And in this case, we're not the martyrs also a reason for the fast spread of Christianity, and maybe you want to say something about the blood of the martyrs,
Right.
Being the seed of the church.
Right. There is a paragraph, we probably should have read that paragraph, in which the crowd at first wants to see blood. At first they are thirsty for blood. But when Perpetua exhibits the nobility of her faith, right, her courage in the face of death, then the editor of the text says that the crowd began to sympathize with her and they began to chant. So I think you're right, Larry. Martyrs had the effect of establishing that it was possible to live with a consistency of belief, right? It was possible to be faithful even up to the point of death. And in a time of anxiety and uncertainty, in a time of economic crisis and moral corruption. The vivid image of a person who lived and even died with consistency, with ethical consistency. I think this did prove to be attractive to people. And I think it's we still have that dynamic like that in the world today, in our time of ethical confusion. I think that the image of a life lived consistently is still very attractive.
I was thinking of two things. One is, one would think that a human being is so repelled by the scene of, and it seemed like it drew large crowds.
It did.
But I know one that reads about Black people in the United States. If there was someone taken into prison and then there was going to be a public hanging, they had postcards and they drew thousands of people for that kind of a similar thing. And then if you think of John Lewis and walking across the bridge and then the blood on his head, that too has a kind of compelling feature of we should not give up the faith that all are created equal and other such beliefs.
Right. I think you're exactly right. Yes.
I was just kind of tying this back to last week's discussion, right? I think that, on the other hand, you know, at least according to McDonald, the pastorals were written to combat this very thing, right?
Yes.
Montanism, the rejection of family, the rebellion against the Roman Empire. Right. So,
and the challenge to the Roman family.
yeah, right.
I mean, the pastoral epistles reinscribe the authority of the father, right? And the values of the Roman family. They attempt to reimpose that.
We have this tension that's
Right.
ever present, I think.
It's exactly right. Within the early Christian movement, there are these Holy Spirit movements of new visions and revelations in which people are challenging the traditional family, but you also have the authors of the pastoral epistles arguing for the preservation of authority. And of course, this text is not in the canon, but the pastoral epistles are in the canon. Yes, Ray.
I was amazed at the difference between Perpetua's account of her prison as opposed to Paul. Paul seemed like it was more humane. He didn't get into all the details like she did, what he was going through. But then that was earlier.
Yes. This is very interesting. Good point. Paul wrote epistles while he was in prison. Many good German scholars, including my friend Angela Stanhardinger at Marburg, have argued that the letter that we call Philippians is actually 3 letters, and that all 3 of those letters were written while Paul was in prison. The little letter to Philemon is also written from prison. Paul tells Philemon at one point, attempting to play upon his heartstrings, Paul says, I, Paul, an old man. He's the only early Christian who tells us his age. Paul says, I, Paul, an old man, and now also a prisoner, a despios. So yes, Paul wrote from prison. Now, what was his experience like there? Philippians is interesting in this regard. Paul gives a couple of glimpses. Paul asks the Philippians to pray with him that he will have the same courage and boldness in his proclamation of the faith when he eventually stands trial. And then something really interesting happens in Philippians. Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 19. Paul says, I find myself in a straight place between two things. On the one hand, I would like to continue to live. That would be better for you, Philippians. Fruitful labor. On the other hand, I would like to what? Depart and be with the Lord. And then Paul says, which of the two I would choose? If a choice were given to me, I do not make known. Wow. One of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, a scholar named Arthur Roche, who now teaches in Canada, published an infamous article in which he argued that Paul was contemplating suicide when he wrote that letter from prison. Right? For me to die is better, Paul says in Philippians. But Paul's own prison experience may have been just as terrible as the experience of Perpetua, but he doesn't give us all the details. We just get little glimpses of his emotional state. In that same letter, in Philippians, Paul pictures himself as a drink offering about to be poured out upon the altar of God. So evidently, Paul thought that the result of his imprisonment might be what? Death. But he was spared. Yes, Larry.
I think it's just interesting the power that comes from the setting when a person faithful to their cause writes from prison. I'm thinking of, I was in the bookstore a couple of days ago, and there was Anne Frank. Well, she was kind of in a prison.
Right.
Then there was Corrie ten Boom right next to that. And then there was a letters from prison by Martin Luther King. And then you get Dietrich Bonhoeffer. These are powerful simply because of the setting.
And there is a mystery to it, a deep mystery, that those who have chosen to take a stand and who have become witnesses, that's the meaning of the Greek word martyr. It means what? Witness. Witness. Those who have chosen to take a stand and who have become witnesses to their faith in Jesus, in the prison, they find not despair, but a strange joy. In Paul's letter to the Philippians, there is a frequently recurring phrase in that letter. What is it? I rejoice. And again, I say rejoice. There is an echo of that in Bonhoeffer's last letter from prison, Larry. His last letter from prison, just before Christmas. And it was written to his parents and his fiancee. And at the end of the letter, he says to them, do not think that I'm sad here or that I'm in despair. No, he said, there is a light in this place. There is joy around my head. And then he says, and Larry, maybe you can help me with the old German nursery rhyme. Bonhoeffer quotes it. He says, as it says in the old German nursery rhyme, two wings enfold, two wings hold. So he says, don't think that I'm sad here. That's Bonhoeffer's last letter from prison. There's this mysterious note of joy that circles in the air above the letter. And it's the psychology of becoming a witness. And we see it here in this text, this early Christian woman, the oldest surviving text by a Christian woman. When she is condemned to death and they bring her and her colleagues the last meal, she says, we transformed it into an agape feast. Yeah. And there was much joy in the prison. Thank you all so much. Next week, we conclude our journey through the women in early Christianity with the incredibly beautiful story of a woman named Macrina. Can't wait for you to learn about her. She was the sister of Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory wrote the biography of his own sister. the account of her life and death. It's beautiful beyond belief. Come back next week.